This is Don Hollenbeck at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. It's dawn here this morning of April 12th, 1861. The long night of waiting is over. In a few minutes, we'll know if the United States is to be divided into two independent nations split by civil war. Major Robert Anderson, commander of Fort Sumter, is about ready to give his reply to the Confederate demand that he surrender this northern fortress in the heart of the seceded South. If Major Anderson does name a surrender date, that will be a sign the federal government is unable to maintain its authority in the slavery states. But if he refuses to yield Sumter, that will be a challenge to the concept of states' rights under which the Confederacy has been formed. The Confederate guns may then open fire on this fort, an act that would probably be the signal for civil war between the North and the South. The officers gathered here in the guardroom at Fort Sumter have received no advance indication as to what Major Anderson will do.
April 12, 1861, Charleston, South Carolina. You are there.
States' rights or federal sovereignty. The North and the South confront each other at Fort Sumter. Will there be peace at the cost of union or civil war? CBS takes you back to the great crisis of the American Republic. All things are as they were then, except for one thing. When CBS is there,
you are there.
You Are There is based on authentic historical fact and quotation. And now,
Charleston, the guardroom at Fort Sumter, and Don Hollenbeck.
Into civil war. There are about 15 officers and men here in the bare, gloomy, candlelit guardroom at Fort Sumter, a room sparsely furnished. It's about 25 feet long with a low vaulted ceiling. It's been a sleepless night. The Confederate delegation, headed by Colonel James Chestnut, arrived about 1 o'clock this morning, delivered the Southern ultimatum to Major Anderson, commander of the fort. That ultimatum demands that Major Anderson name the day when he'll surrender Fort Sumter. It implies that force will be used if the major refuses to yield. Major Anderson and his staff went immediately into conference. They've been in the major's office these past 3 hours framing an answer. A moment ago, the major sent word by his orderly that he's about ready to reply, and we're waiting for him to appear. The three members of the Confederate delegation are sitting at the guardroom table with Colonel Chestnut, the head of the delegation. There are Captain Stephen D. Lee, Lieutenant Colonel A.R. Chisholm, and one civilian, Congressman Roger Pryor of Virginia. The Southerners seem calm, confident, but the men of this federal garrison, on the other hand, are nervous and tense. They're running low on provisions. They've been almost blockaded for 3 weeks. Ever since the election of Abraham Lincoln last November on an anti-slavery platform, his election, of course, has brought this crisis between the North and South to a head. While Major Anderson's just come into the guardroom, he's walking toward the Southern delegation at the table. Major Anderson's 56, tall, graduate of West Point, fought with distinction in the Indian and Mexican wars. The major's from Kentucky. He's a slave owner himself, yet his sympathies are certain to be pro-Union. Now Major Anderson has stopped at the table. Now he's facing Colonel Chestnut, the head of the Southern delegation.
Colonel.
Major Anderson is speaking.
Forgive me for keeping you waiting so long. Important decisions are not made easily.
We appreciate that, sir.
Colonel, as I informed you earlier, Fort Sumter's food supplies are exhausted. Unless we receive provisions, we shall be starved out in 3 days. Please inform your government that I shall surrender Fort Sumter 3 days from now, on the 15th of April. Unless, prior to that date, I receive new instructions from my government at Washington for additional provisions.
In other words, you refuse to surrender.
I just told you, Colonel. I will evacuate this fort on the 15th, unless...
That won't do, Major Anderson. My government will not accept a qualified answer. We know as well as you that Mr. Lincoln has dispatched a fleet to bring you provisions, and that fleet should arrive here sometime today. We want a hard and fast answer, no ifs or buts. We want your word that you will surrender this fort at once immediately.
I can't do that, Colonel Chestnut. It would be a violation of my honor. I have an obligation to the government of the United States.
Major Anderson, you as a Southerner owe a sacred obligation to the people of the South.
I am an officer of the United States Army.
Sir, I have authority of Brigadier General Beauregard, commanding the provisional forces of the Confederate States of America. I have the honor to inform you that as soon as I reach our guns to give the command, we will open the fire of our batteries on Fort Sumter. Good day, sir.
Colonel Chestnut and Major Anderson exchange salutes. Colonel Chestnut and his party are leaving the guardroom now. It will take them some little time to row across the harbor to the nearest Confederate guns. Now Major Anderson has turned to talk to several officers who gathered round him. As soon as he's finished, we'll try to get a word with him. The Major looks pale. There's an expression of great sadness on his face. He's been pushed into this situation. As we said, Major Anderson is from Kentucky, probably torn by conflicting loyalties to the South and to the federal government. The Major stopped talking to his officers. Major Anderson, sir, may we have a word with you, please?
Well, only a moment. I'm very busy.
I understand, sir. Major, do you think Colonel Chestnut will make good that threat to fire on you?
I hope not, sir. But if he does, we shall answer fire with fire.
Well, if the bombardment does take place, how long do you think you can hold out?
If a bombardment takes place, the fate of Fort Sumter won't matter. We shall then be concerned with civil war. With the fate of our country, sir.
Thank you very much, Major Anderson. The Major's leaving the guardroom. The other federal officers and soldiers are talking quietly now. Nothing they can do but wait. And now for some comments on Major Anderson's reply to Colonel Chestnut. We take you to our studios in Washington and Quincy Howe.
We've just heard Colonel Chestnut threaten to fire on Sumter without first consulting his government. That's the Confederate government at Montgomery, Alabama. That's strange. You'd really think in such a crisis as this, Colonel Chestnut would telegraph Major Anderson's reply to his superiors in Montgomery. Then Confederate President Jefferson Davis would have had to make the decision whether or not to wait for Fort Sumter to surrender on the 15th of April. But apparently Colonel Chestnut just didn't do that. He pointed out that a federal provision fleet is steaming toward Sumter, and he threatened to open fire on the fort in a few minutes. Of course, it may well be that the colonel is just bluffing, hoping the threat will cause Major Anderson to surrender right away, before the food ships arrive, that is. Major Anderson still has time to indicate surrender. He can raise a white flag or lower the stars and stripes from Fort Sumter's mast. If Major Anderson does not surrender, and if Colonel Chestnut means what he says, the decision on peace or war lies with President Abraham Lincoln right here in Washington. The President can still, of course, telegraph Major Anderson instructions to surrender Fort Sumter. That would avoid an armed conflict between the North and the South. I've just been informed that President Lincoln is about to speak to reporters at the White House. Doug Edwards is there. So we take you now to the White House, and go ahead, Doug Edwards.
The doors to the President's sitting room have just been opened, and correspondents from every section of the country, including the South, are entering. President Lincoln is sitting at the desk. With Mr. Lincoln are his personal secretary, Mr. Hay, and the Secretary of State, Mr. Seward. Mr. Lincoln shows the strain of waiting for telegraph bulletins from the fort. He looks very tired. His face is drawn, his shoulders are bent, and his black coat is wrinkled. The sitting room door has just been shut. The next voice you hear will be that of President Abraham Lincoln.
Gentlemen, you know by now that the guns of the Confederacy threatened to open fire on Fort Sumter. The senior officer of the fort, Major Anderson, has refused to surrender unless he receives instructions to do so from me. The country has a right to know where I stand on this question. My position was made clear in my inaugural address. At that time, I said, acts of violence within any states against the authority of the United States are revolutionary. I said further, the Constitution expressly enjoins upon me that the laws of the Union be faithfully executed in all the states. I said the power confided in me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the places and property of a government. And that includes Fort Sumter. Now, Gentlemen, I shall be glad to answer your questions to the best of my ability.
Mr. President, does that mean you won't order Fort Sumter to surrender?
Please. One at a time.
Mr. President, I represent the Charleston Mercury. Do your remarks mean that you will not order Major Anderson to surrender Fort Sumter?
We may not think the same way about the Constitution in Charleston as we do in Springfield, but I think we speak the same brand of English.
Speaking is easy, Mr. President, but will you fight for Fort Sumter?
I do not anticipate bloodshed.
Mr. President, is it your opinion that the Confederate threat to fire on Fort Sumter is only a bluff?
I don't know. But if the threat is in earnest, I trust that saner men will not permit it to be carried out. I trust that the leaders of the South will prevail on the officers at Charleston not to plunge the nation into civil war.
Mr. President, the people of the South feel that your party is forcing a civil war by its stand on the issue of slavery. What about that, Mr. President?
The issue before the country is not slavery. I have said time and again that I have no intention of interfering with the institution of slavery in the states where it now exists. The issue is the continuation of the Union.
But on that point, Mr. President, Southern statesmen argue that nothing in the Constitution binds any state to remain in the Union.
Southern statesmen are trying to make the states' rights tail wag the Union dog. In my opinion, the Union is supreme. No combination of states can get out of the Union on their own motion. Resolutions to that effect are illegal.
Nevertheless, Mr. President, 6 Southern states have seceded. They claim Fort Sumter is Confederate property. Now, will you go to war to hold that property for the North?
Not for the North, sir, but for the